Nobody saw this coming, not even the people inside the building. The Chicago Sky have reportedly moved on from Angel Reese, sending her to the Atlanta Dream in a deal that instantly split the entire league in half. 2 future first-round picks and a second-round swap is what Chicago accepted in return for a player who, just a season ago, was being talked about as the face of the franchise. And the reaction was instant. Some people are calling it a smart reset. Others are calling it one of the most confusing roster decisions in recent WNBA history. Because on paper, this is not just any player. We are talking about a 2-time All-Star, a rebounding machine, and one of the most recognizable young names in the sport. So the question writes itself. Why would a front office move off a player like that for what looks like future potential instead of proven value? And even more importantly, what does this say about what was really happening behind the scenes in Chicago that fans were not fully seeing? Because while the stats tell one story, the decision tells another. And somewhere in between those two versions of reality is where this entire situation starts to get uncomfortable. And once you connect those dots, you start to realize this might not just be a basketball trade at all. Before this trade ever happened, the story around Angel Reese was already bigger than basketball. She arrived in the WNBA carrying a spotlight most rookies never experience. Coming off a national championship run at LSU, she entered Chicago not just as a draft pick, but as a media phenomenon. Every game, every stat line, every moment was instantly amplified across social media. For Chicago Sky, it felt like the start of something new, a reset, a franchise player to build around, someone who could bring attention, energy, and identity back to a team trying to find its direction. And at first glance, the production looked like exactly that. Double-doubles started stacking up. Rebounding numbers were showing up in record conversations. 2 All-Star selections came early, and the narrative quickly formed that Chicago had landed a cornerstone piece for the future. But inside that growing hype, a different conversation was starting to form quietly. While the spotlight was getting brighter, the wins were not following at the same pace. The expectations were rising faster than the results. And that gap between attention and outcome is usually where pressure begins to build in ways the box score never shows. Still, at this stage, nobody was talking about problems. They were talking about potential. And that is what makes what happened next feel so much heavier in hindsight. As the seasons went on, the conversation around Angel Reese started shifting away from hype and towards something more uncomfortable. Because when you strip away the headlines and focus only on the numbers, a different picture begins to appear. Yes, the rebounding stood out. Yes, the double-doubles kept coming. And yes, the All-Star recognition gave her the label of a rising force in the league. But the efficiency never matched the volume. Her shooting percentages stayed in a range that raised questions rather than confidence. Roughly around the low 40s from the field, with finishing inside the paint often inconsistent, and outside shooting still not something defenses had to respect. From three-point range, the threat was close to non-existent, which allowed opposing teams to collapse the floor without consequence. And that changes everything in modern basketball. Because when defenses do not have to stretch, they do not have to adjust. They can load the paint, force tougher attempts, and turn every possession into a physical battle instead of a tactical one. That is where the real debate started. Was Chicago getting production or just activity? Because there is a difference between filling a stat sheet and actually bending a defense. One creates numbers, the other creates wins. And as the losses kept piling up for the Chicago Sky, that question started getting harder to ignore. This is where the conversation around Angel Reese really started to split the audience. Because her rebounding numbers were impossible to ignore. Game after game, she was pulling down boards at a rate that put her in rare company. On the surface, it looked like dominance, control, effort that could not be coached. But critics began pointing out something else happening inside those numbers. A significant portion of those rebounds were coming on the offensive glass after missed shots, sometimes even her own attempts near the rim. That created a second possession, but also exposed a pattern that started to change how people interpreted the stat line. Instead of one efficient scoring possession, it became 2 attempts to get the same result. And that is where the empty stats argument began to grow. Because in basketball, context matters just as much as totals. A rebound that extends a possession is valuable. But a rebound that follows a missed high-percentage look raises a different kind of question about decision-making and efficiency. Supporters saw hustle, aggression, and relentless energy. Critics saw extra possessions being created out of missed opportunities. And somewhere in the middle, the debate turned less about what the numbers were and more about what they actually meant. That tension is exactly what kept Chicago Sky at the center of scrutiny all season long, even when the box score looked impressive on paper. At the end of the day, the only number that truly matters in professional basketball is the win column. And for Chicago Sky, that column kept moving in the wrong direction. As Angel Reese settled into her role, expectations were high that the franchise would begin climbing back toward playoff contention. Instead, the opposite happened. The record stayed under pressure, with seasons finishing deep in the losing range and little evidence of a sustained turnaround. That is where the frustration started to grow across the fan base and front office conversations. Because teams can tolerate development. Teams can tolerate growing pains. What they cannot tolerate is stagnation, especially when the spotlight is as bright as it was here. The argument became simple but uncomfortable. If a player is producing all-star level recognition, rebounding at a historic pace, and still the team is not improving, then what exactly is driving the gap between individual success and team failure? Was it roster construction, system fit, coaching structure, or was the production simply not translating into the kind of impact that changes outcomes? And as those questions lingered, the narrative around Chicago stopped being about potential and started becoming about direction. Because in professional sports, once a team begins to feel stuck in place, change is no longer optional. It becomes inevitable. And this is where the conversation stopped being just about Chicago. Because at the exact same time, Caitlin Clark was rewriting expectations in Indiana. From day one with the Indiana Fever, the impact was visible in a completely different way. Not just in scoring bursts, but in how the entire offense started to look more organized, more spaced, and more connected. Teammates like Kelsey Mitchell and Aaliyah Boston found themselves in clearer roles, cleaner looks, and more consistent rhythm. The system around them started to feel simpler, and more importantly, more effective. And that is where the contrast became unavoidable. Because while Chicago was dealing with questions about efficiency and fit, Indiana was dealing with a completely different reality, a team trying to adjust upward because of one player's presence. Clark's rookie season was defined not just by records, but by visibility and structure. Every possession carried attention, and every defensive adjustment created opportunities for someone else. So naturally, the comparison started spreading across fan bases. One side pointed to rebounding numbers and all-star selections. The other pointed to pace, spacing, and team improvement. And that debate is exactly what turned this entire story from a trade discussion into a league-wide conversation about what impact actually means in modern basketball. As the noise around Angel Reese grew louder, so did the reports and conversations coming out of the Chicago environment. Inside Chicago Sky, the season was not just defined by wins and losses anymore. It was defined by moments that suggested friction, misalignment, and a lack of full cohesion between different parts of the roster. One of the most talked about situations involved veteran leadership and communication dynamics. Comments made about teammates, including discussions around roster direction and experience levels, began to circulate publicly, and that immediately changed how the locker room was perceived from the outside. Because in professional sports, internal trust is everything. Once public remarks start reflecting private frustration, every interaction gets heavier. Every possession feels more loaded. Every loss becomes more personal than organizational. At the same time, there were growing signs that the fit on the floor was not fully natural. Certain combinations struggled with spacing. Offensive flow became inconsistent, and roles were never fully stable enough to create rhythm across the roster. And when a team is already losing, those small cracks become much bigger very quickly. What makes this phase important is not any single incident, but the accumulation of them. One moment can be explained. A pattern becomes harder to ignore. By the time the season reached its later stages, the conversation was no longer about potential adjustments. It was about whether the environment itself could still hold together under pressure. By the time the season reached its most tense stretch, the situation around Angel Reese had already moved. Beyond simple on-court discussion, the focus inside Chicago Sky was no longer just about performance. It was about control, consistency, and whether the team could maintain stability through the final phase of the year. Reports of technical fouls, emotional moments, and escalating frustration added another layer to the conversation. In professional basketball, repeated disciplinary attention is never just treated as noise. It becomes part of the internal evaluation process. Eventually, the situation reached a point where team decisions reflected that tension directly. A suspension tied to conduct and accumulated technical issues signaled that the organization was no longer just observing problems, it was responding to them. And once a franchise takes that step, the relationship changes. Because suspensions are not isolated events. They are usually the result of repeated patterns, internal discussions, and attempts at correction that did not fully resolve the underlying issues. On top of that, the season itself ended with uncertainty, including missed time and questions around availability late in the year. Whether framed as injury management or not, the timing only added more speculation to an already unstable narrative. At that point, the situation was no longer about potential upside. It was about whether the cost of ongoing instability outweighed the value of keeping things the same. When the trade sending Angel Reese to the Atlanta Dream became official, the reaction did not just stay in Chicago. It immediately shifted into a new question in Atlanta. Does this actually work? Because on paper, the Atlanta Dream already had an established frontcourt identity. Players like Brittany Griner and Brianna Jones operate best close to the rim, in controlled post touches and half-court sets where physicality and interior positioning define the offense. Now add another high-use paint presence into that same structure, and the spacing question becomes unavoidable. With Reese, beyond simple on-court discussion, the focus inside Chicago Sky was no longer just about performance. It was about control, consistency, and whether the team could maintain stability through the final phase of the year. Reports of technical fouls, emotional moments, and escalating frustration added another layer to the conversation. In professional basketball, repeated disciplinary attention is never just treated as noise. It becomes part of the internal evaluation process. Eventually, the situation reached a point where team decisions reflected that tension directly. A suspension tied to conduct and accumulated technical issues signaled that the organization was no longer just observing problems, it was responding to them. And once a franchise takes that step, the relationship changes. Because suspensions are not isolated events. They are usually the result of repeated patterns, internal discussions, and attempts at correction that did not fully resolve the underlying issues. On top of that, the season itself ended with uncertainty, including missed time and questions around availability late in the year. Whether framed as injury management or not, the timing only added more speculation to an already unstable narrative. At that point, the situation was no longer about potential upside. It was about whether the cost of ongoing instability outweighed the value of keeping things the same. When the trade sending Angel Reese to the Atlanta Dream became official, the reaction did not just stay in Chicago. It immediately shifted into a new question in Atlanta. Does this actually work? Because on paper, the Atlanta Dream already had an established frontcourt identity. Players like Brittany Griner and Brianna Jones operate best close to the rim, in controlled post touches and half-court sets where physicality and interior positioning define the offense. Now add another high-use paint presence into that same structure, and the spacing question becomes unavoidable. With Reese, another player who does not stretch the floor consistently, defenses do not have to expand outward. They can stay packed inside, collapse driving lanes, and turn every possession into a crowded interior battle. That changes how guards like Ryan Howard and Alisha Gray operate. Instead of clean driving angles and open perimeter rhythm, they are forced into tighter windows and more contested reads. And that is where the concern starts to grow, because modern offenses are not just built on talent. They are built on spacing, timing, and compatibility between roles. If too many players need the same area of the floor to be effective, something eventually has to give. Atlanta is now betting that raw talent and rebounding presence can outweigh those structural concerns. But critics see a different possibility. A roster that looks strong individually, but struggles collectively when it comes to flow, spacing, and offensive balance under pressure. Once the details of the deal became public, the focus quickly shifted from fit to value. The return for Angel Reese, moving from Chicago Sky to the Atlanta Dream, was framed around future assets, including multiple late first-round picks and a second-round swap. On paper, that is the kind of package usually associated with long-term planning, not immediate star-level trades. And that is exactly why the reaction split so sharply. On one side, there is the argument that Chicago prioritized flexibility over everything else, clearing the roster, resetting the timeline, and moving into a new phase built around younger structural pieces rather than continuing to invest in a situation that had already peaked internally. On the other side, critics argue that this is exactly the type of deal you never make if you truly believe you are trading away a star. Because in professional basketball, true franchise-level players rarely leave for future draft capital alone. There is usually a proven player coming back, or at least immediate roster help. Here, the return is entirely speculative, dependent on future draft positioning and development outcomes years down the line. That uncertainty is what fuels the fleeced conversation online. But front offices do not evaluate trades purely on surface value. They also evaluate timing, internal dynamics, and long-term direction. And in this case, Chicago made the decision quickly, which suggests urgency mattered as much as return. The biggest takeaway from this section of the story is not just what was received, but how fast it was accepted. Because in most cases, when a team hesitates, it is trying to maximize value. When it moves quickly, it matches. If it does not, spacing issues and role overlap could limit how far the roster can realistically go in high-leverage games. Either way, the outcome of this move will not be judged immediately. It will be judged in how the next season unfolds under playoff pressure. And that is what makes this decision so significant. Because once a team commits to a reset like this, there is no quick way to reverse it. At this point, the debate around Angel Reese is no longer just about highlights or stat lines. It is about interpretation. Was this a case of a young star being misunderstood while carrying a flawed system? Or was this a situation where individual production simply never translated into winning impact at the level the franchise needed? The Chicago Sky made their decision. They moved forward. They reset the direction of the roster and accepted future assets over present uncertainty. Now the pressure shifts somewhere else entirely. Because every move like this eventually gets judged in hindsight. If Atlanta turns this into a functional contender, it becomes a bold win-now gamble. If it collapses under spacing and chemistry issues, it becomes another example of talent not always meaning fit. And sitting in the middle of all of it is a league still trying to define what true impact really looks like in modern basketball. So now the question goes to you. Was this the right move for Chicago? Or did they just walk away from a player they gave up on too early? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is the kind of debate that is not ending anytime soon.